Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and this video is a response to Sam's request on the Tides of Change Star Wars Facebook group, which I'll put a link to down below, where he said that it'd be useful to see how some of the people who've run games on there plan out sessions. Now, as it just so happens, I have the first session of my Red Hand of the Empire trilogy coming up, where the players are portraying people who are being trained up to become inquisitors, hunting down force users on behalf of the Empire. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to take you through the stages that I go through to plan out that session. Now, obviously, this isn't my session approach for all different sessions. Different games, different lengths of games I have different approaches for all of them. However, this is the approach that I tend to use for one-offs, or in this case, a loosely connected group of one-shots. When I'm planning for a session, I like to go through a 6-step plan, and these stages are thinking about it, information gathering, writing an outline, looking for inspiration, fleshing out the game plan, and finally getting my materials together. So in this video, I'm going to take you through all those 6 stages and show you how I go about them. Now, of course, if you're going to be actually playing in the Red Hand of the Empire trilogy that I'm going to be running, I would ask you please not to view this video until after the first session has actually been completed. Otherwise, it'll ruin some of the surprises. So with that said, let's crack on with the rest of the video. Okay, so the very first thing I do when it comes to preparing a session, before I even write anything down, is I just think about it and mull it over for a little bit. Now, this may seem like an obvious thing, however, I can't overstate the importance of just taking a little time to actually think through and think around the idea that you've initially come up with. If you just start jumping straight in and start banging ideas down in your word processor or on paper, whatever you choose to use, then you'll find yourself, you're rushing yourself into making decisions. You'll find that just thinking about it over a little period of time will have you come up with ideas that you might otherwise have missed, or perhaps you'll take inspiration from something that occurs in your own life. So if you do have the time, I would advise you just take a step back from it for a moment before plunging into all the planning, and just mull the idea over, kick it around for a bit inside your head and see where that takes you. Okay, so one of the first things I like to do before I even start worrying about what the actual session's going to be is I like to make some notes about the actual characters I'm going to have. So if I open this folder here, which has got all my gubbins in for the Red Hand of the Empire session 1 that's coming up, I've got all of the character sheets in here. So I'm just going to open those and get them loaded into my PDF reader. There we go, and these were all made using Oggdude's Character generator, which is a great program. I'll put a link in the description at the bottom of this video. So all I'm doing now is I'm just going to scroll through here. Let's get rid of that to make it a bit easier to see. And I'm just going to have a look for anything that particularly stands out as being particularly important to that character. And whilst I'm doing it, I'm going to open a small notepad window, which I'll put just here, and I'm just going to note down anything that I think is particularly striking or seems particularly important about the character concept that I can use during the session. So apologies if the typing gets a little bit loud. Okay, so we can see Asher Sun Kine. Spiritual veneration has led her to disdain material possessions, comforts and the self to a large extent. She seeks to be guided by the enlightened will of the Empire as laid down by Lord Vader and the Emperor, to make their purpose hers at the expense of all else. So, spiritual person, 100% dedicated to the cause of the Empire. And let's have a look at the background. So, minor noble, born on Kuat. Okay, so was effectively sold into service by a family. Who supply arms to the Empire. Okay, and I quite like this last couple of sentences. She's not the reading marauder that could one day menace entire battalions of soldiers. She has sworn herself to a subtle darkness, the kind that seeps in unnoticed and slowly erodes everything it touches. She's already feeling the erosion working on her as her talent with the Force grows. So, subtle darkness. And there we go, that's just 4 points, which I think sum up this character. So I'm now going to move on to the others and do likewise, just making a few bullet points so I've got a document that I can quickly reference when I do the rest of my planning. Okay, so now I've got my reference document there done for the player characters. I've created a basic plot outline document here, and I like to split the session up into an encounter for each hour that's going to take place, since there's only a limited amount of time during a one-off session. Now I know that technically this is part of a trilogy, so it's 3 sort of interlinked one-shots, but still we don't have the breadth of time to fully explore things and take a slightly more meandering path as we might do during a campaign game. So first of all, I'm going to look at what the goal of the session is. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the goal of this first session is to get players used to the Force and Destiny rules system, get them used to experiencing the narrative dice used with FFG Star Wars. Now, this is important, I feel, because it's quite possible I'll have players at different levels of familiarity with the rules, and even if you are familiar with them, it never hurts to get a quick refresher just to make sure it's at the forefront of your mind as you go into an actual game. The other goal is to get them used to working as a group, since they're going to be a tightly knit cell of Inquisitors who will be working together in the future sessions. Now, looking at my player document, we've got a couple of people who want knowledge and have a more spiritual side about the Force, so I want to say something about the nature of the Force. And we've also got a couple of people who want to perfect their abilities or who want to practice their sword skills, etc. So giving them an opportunity for combat. And it's always a good way with a combat, as well as being interesting and exciting, it's a good thing to get people used to using the rules system. So next I'm going to move on to our introduction. Now, I've already done an intro crawl for this event, which basically says that Lord Vader is taking his teenaged Inquisitors to a planet on the Outer Rim where they've received some anomalous readings. I'll put a link to that down below. Now, I kept that quite vague, both because I hadn't decided precisely on the shape of the session yet, but I wanted to give the players some sort of advanced teaser of the sort of thing they were going to be going into to get a bit of enthusiasm going for them creating the characters, etc. Obviously, now I've got the characters, I'm doing the actual planning for the session. So the intro is going to start with them on a shuttle, and it's probably a Lambda class Imperial shuttle, because let's face it, they are an instantly recognisable sort of icon of Star Wars. And if you don't know what I mean by a Lambda class shuttle, it's the one the Emperor arrives in with the big fold down wings. Very easily recognisable, and I think it's a good thing in Star Wars RPGs to include these easily recognisable ships, planets, species, etc., because it lets people know that yes, they are in the Star Wars universe. It makes them comfortable, it helps them relax into the game, so it's a good thing to do, I think. So they're on a shuttle being taken by Lord Vader. I can spell to the outer rim planet. So I'm going to make the anomalous readings. Now, part of this is a contrivance on Lord Vader's behalf, or a ruse. The idea of this is actually to throw the teenage Inquisitors in at the deep end and see how they cope on their own. A sort of sink or swim, really, since they can't afford any sense of weakness or lack of inner strength in the Inquisitorium. So what I'm actually going to have happen is I'm going to have Vader drop them in the sort of passenger compartment into the planet's orbit, and we're going to start straight off with that because I want to instantly get a bit of excitement, a bit of motion, a bit of forward motion to get the session moving, rather than having it linger around in a sort of long running initial preamble at the start of the session. We don't really have time for that in this sort of one-shot scenario, so I want to jump straight in. So literally they're going to be sat in the shuttle, and as we start the session I'm going to be describing suddenly the compartment they're in, dropping out and heading down towards the planet. The planet's rushing up towards them very quickly. At the last minute some atmospheric thrusters will fire and they'll come to probably a fairly bumpy landing in this cargo compartment. Now, I don't want to leave any real doubt about what their mission is here, since, like I say, we're always a little bit pushed for time in one shots. So what I'm then going to have happen is I'm going to have Vader via a HoloNet communication tell them that this is a test, and that if they prove worthy, they will be picked up. If not, then they won't survive. Since, as I say, this is a very much survival of the fittest, sink or swim, but they will have to rely on each other to survive. So next I'm going to move on to the challenges. Okay, now we've got people who want to try out combat, and as I say, it's a great way to get people into rolling the dice. It's fast, it's action packed. The easiest way to have a combat happen on a sort of a wilderness world is to have it be with some sort of fauna or flora of the planet that's hostile. So I'm going to put hostile animal / plant attacks, and this is a nice way to just ease people into using the rules. They can try out their force powers, etc. There's no real moral ambiguity here, and it's also interesting for me to initially, as a GM, see how the players are going to react as their characters to this situation. Now, after I've done that, I want to move on to a slightly more complex encounter, and I've already said I wanted to talk about the nature of the Force, since that's something that at least a couple of the characters are interested in. And I remember, not so much in the FFG version of Star Wars, but in certainly, I think in one of the old D20 versions of Star Wars, there was like a sort of primitive version of a Force user as a class. Not really a Jedi, more sort of like an ancient shaman sort of idea. And there's obviously links to the sort of Dathomiri Night Sisters and stuff like that in Star Wars canon. So I'm going to use a primitive society of dark side Force users. I'm going to put led by shaman. So these primitive shaman have a position of importance within the society that they belong, and it'll be up to the player characters how they deal with them. Do they attempt to kill all of these Force users to get them out of the way so that they can't become the new Jedi or whatever, or do they try and bring them into the fold of the Empire, perhaps bringing them ever more into the clutches of the dark side? it's a bit of a moral quandary for the player characters, and it gives them a bit more sort of freedom about what they want to do, etc. Now, in addition to that, I also want to throw in some wilderness survival checks. Just so that people who've got that skill can get a chance to use it and just see how well they're doing at the general day-to-day survival on the planet. Now, since we don't have time to cover all of this sort of number of days that they're going to be surviving on this primitive planet in great detail, because we've only got like 3 or 4 hours in the session, I'm just going to ask for a few checks to get a general overall feel of how they're doing. And aside from that, we'll focus on the animal attack and dealing with this primitive society of force users. So that pretty much covers our 1 encounter per hour. We've got the intro, we've got the animal attack, we've got the primitive society of force users, then we've got the wrap up or the conclusion. So now I'm going to turn to thinking about the location. Now, we've already said we want it to be a primitive world, and with a sort of tribal society. Now, I'm not going to make this any particular world according to the Star Wars canon, since I don't really think that's necessary, since the players probably aren't going to be coming back here. So I'll probably come up with some sort of name for it, which will probably be the primitive society's name for it rather than the proper imperial name for it. But it's not going to be anything within the canon. It's not necessary. What I do want to do, though, is because I think it's very important in Star Wars that the locations are quite fantastic, whether it be ocean worlds, jungle worlds, desert worlds. There's always something interesting about it. I mean, that could be a wrecked Star Destroyer lying in the desert sands. It could be an Imperial base rising above the jungle canopy, or some indigenous people. Whatever, they all have these fantastic elements. Now, although the player characters don't have lightsabers at the minute, they're going to have an opportunity to make those in one of the future sessions. So as a sort of bit of foreshadowing for that, and a possible return to this planet, I'm going to have some crystalline structures on the planet. I also want some natural hazards. So I want to try and bring like the weather and the surroundings into the combats that are going on. So it's a great way of making them a bit more interesting. So I'm going to say that the planet is covered in constant electrical storms. Now, what I'll probably do with that is I'll probably say that anyone getting like a really low roll or has a particularly nasty failure stands a chance of getting struck by lightning. And I think we can also tie that very nicely into this primitive society of force users. Perhaps the shaman hold their position because they ward off the storms. This also gives an interesting possibility of, can the players learn to ward them off using the force? Is it even electricity? Perhaps it's dark side energy. So that gives me some things to think about for the world. And of course, the wrap up is the ideal situation is they prove themselves worthy and get picked up. So there we are. That's the basic session plan detailed out. Now I'm going to have a think about this for a while, then I'm going to come back, start fleshing it out, putting a few more details in. Then I'll start looking at choosing antagonists, laying out the areas, any maps that are required, etc. And then we'll see where we go from there. Okay, so now that I've got the rough plan written here and I've got my character outline document here to remind me of the sort of stuff I want to include in my session, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start looking for sources of inspiration, things to give me some ideas to go on and help me a little bit further down the process, flesh out this fairly basic at the moment outline into what we're actually going to use in our session as the final game plan. So first of all, I'm just going to pick a few things out that I think it'd be good to find more details about. And I'm just going to note these down at the bottom of my character outline document just to keep it all neat and tidy in one place. So let's look at our plot outline. Okay, so we've got the hostile animal and plant attacks. Now, obviously, I want these to be sort of very vivid. I don't just want it to feel like an exercise in dice rolling, even though its main purpose is to get people used to the rules. I still want it to be something very visually striking. The creatures you get in Star Wars are weird and wonderful. Now, I'm not going to worry about stats at the moment because they'll come later, and they are entirely removed from the appearance of the creature. I could take any stats out of one of the many Star Wars books I've got and use them for a creature. No, what I'm looking for is something interesting and something that ties in with our idea of this primitive planet with these weird sort of crystalline structures. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to open up my browser window, and on the good old Google image search, now that's certainly got possibilities. After all, spiders are things which a lot of people find inherently unlikable. Perhaps we could even have the actual animal that attacks at the start to be the same sort of crystalline entities that are found later on. That'd be a nice link in, rather than it just being like an isolated animal attack. It could actually have some link into the later plot involving this primitive society and these shamans who have some abilities over them. Now, since we also want to have the lightning linked in with the spiders, perhaps make a note of that. So, okay, so we need something for the, we've got the spiders, animals to attack, crystal creatures. We also need a picture for the primitive force using aliens. Then I probably want some stuff for like a general idea of what the planet's like. And that should hopefully give me a decent selection of pictures and some additional ideas and inspiration to go on. We've already started determining and fleshing this out just by choosing these pictures. For instance, we now know that these creatures, these crystal beings, are some form of spider. You can extend that by saying, well, perhaps they spin wet crystalline webs across the planet. That's something that can be put into the background, an extra little bit of flesh that's been added on to the bones. So now I'm going to look for these pictures of these aliens. So it's primitive aliens. Now, I might actually use this picture for an overlay in the game to show up on the screen to say this is what the aliens look like, or perhaps it'll just colour my description. I'm not yet sure. Just for those particular aliens, but that's fine. I could always use that as a basic overlay picture and then embroider it with descriptions later on. I quite like these sort of spiny growths that are coming out the back of the heads of the creatures, and perhaps that can be tied into their force sensitivity. They're sensitive to the vibrations in the air on the planet. They know when a storm's coming, etc. Again, adding more flesh onto the bones. So we've got all of those, and we want some pictures of the general idea of what the planet is like. So let's try lightning planet. And there's lots of pictures from space, so I'll try something else. I'll try crystal planet. this looks a little bit more promising. Just scroll down a few of these, see if there's anything suitable. That looks quite cool, but it's a bit Arctic-y. I think it's the Fortress of Solitude. Again, that's nice. That's off the Star Wars wiki. I'm not sure what exactly it is, what planet it is, but it looks a little bit too high-tech for these purposes. Let's have a look what this one is here. That looks quite nice. I quite like the look of that. Very futuristic, but no overt displays of technology. So let's have a look at the image in full. Yeah, that's quite otherworldly, quite interesting. So I'm going to save that again into the same folder. And what I'll do is at the next stage, when it comes to fleshing out the plan, the sort of bare bones that we've got at the moment, I'll look at these pictures and that'll give me some inspiration to add some more flesh onto the plan that we're going to use for the actual session. Okay, and for the next stage I'm just going to flesh out the notes that I've written a little bit. So that's just going through and adding in some extra detail now I've had a bit of a chance to think about it. Okay, so I'll save that, and that's pretty much our fleshed out plan. The next thing to do is to come up with the stats for the various antagonists. So to come up with the stats for the antagonist, I'm going to open up my Oggdude Character generator. And I'm going to go into the GM tools. And I'm going to import some new adversaries from the details that I've got saved on my computer. Now there's no particular art to this, there's no combat creation matrix or specific formula to create a balanced combat in Fantasy Flight games, Star Wars, as there is in some other role-playing games. So I'm just going to look through and look for things that I think might be applicable. And that looks a fairly appropriate stat for it. So normally if I was going to do a large scale sort of combat with lots of different enemies, I could create an encounter for this where I could have all the enemies' stats printed out on one sheet. Since this is just going to be for this spider that I'm using the mature Tusk stats for, I'm going to save this simple stat block. So that's saved as an image file. Now I need to find something for the natives. So again, go back to import. I'm going to start having a look through here. I'm not looking for anything too massively overpowering for the natives. I mainly want them to be minions so we can have like quite a lot of them without them just swamping the player characters. Now I'm going to use the antiquated battle droid stats since they're fairly sort of middle of the range stats, and all I'll do is when I use these I'll ignore the droid characteristics. I'll change the ranged heavy skill to something more appropriate, probably a melee skill, and I'll replace the weapon with something appropriate like a primitive spear. But other than that, I can use the stats as is. So I'll save those. Now I need something for their shaman, so since this is going to be a force user, I'll see if there's anything in the force and destiny enemy stats that I could use. And we've got the fallen apprentice there, who is a rival, so it's not a nemesis level massive sort of NPC, but I'm going to have a quick look at that. Fallen apprentice. Let's have a look at the stat block. So there we go. So he's got abilities with a lightsaber, discipline, resilience, reasonable block of stats. He's got the adversary talent, which means he's more difficult to hit, and he's got a couple of little abilities that he can use and a basic lightsaber. Now what I'll probably do is I'll probably swap out the basic lightsaber for some other piece of equipment and maybe jig his skills around a little bit, but by and large that will quite happily serve for my shaman of this primitive alien village, so I'm going to save that. And there we are, that's the stats about picked for this particular adventure. All I need to do now is, for the final bit, get my materials together, produce any pictures, overlays that I'm going to do, and then I'll be about as ready to run the session as I can be. So the last thing for me to do is I'm going to create the overlays that I'm going to use in my session using the pictures that I downloaded and that you saw earlier on in this video. I'm doing this using my copy of Photoshop, although you could use GIMP or any of the other free graphics packages for that. So there you have it. That's a short look at how I go about planning for a one-shot session. I hope that's been of some use, and that if you've enjoyed it, you'll click on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. You can check us out on all the various social media and at our blog, which I'll put the details for in the description of this video. As always, if you have any comments, please either put them down below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. So until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.